Welcome to panel 3. I'm Larry Wilner. I own the company, The Strategies That Work, and I'm the mastermind behind this enterprise today. And I'm really honored to have these 3 gentlemen join us because they're just so smart, and it's been a pleasure to work with them. And I come out of a background of a small business that we succeeded. It was a legacy business, family style business, is that what we call it? And that we didn't plan it. It just kind of moved from my father to me, and then for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is technology and market shifts, we closed that business. And I always wondered, about 6 months ago, a year ago, I thought, boy, if I knew more at that time, would it have turned out differently? And maybe if I knew these gentlemen more at that time, things would have turned out differently. So we're going to just jump right into what the new landscapes look like. And I want to start with you, John, because I know a lot of people, you work with a lot of people that get those exit checks. So they've done all their planning, they've done all their evaluations, they've gone through the process, and now they get their money, right? It's time for them to go on. So tell me a little bit of what that looks like now. Has that changed? Has your environment changed for those?
Well, no, it hasn't. Our clientele is pretty unique. Whether it's a business owner or whether it's an athlete, the way their revenue comes in, it's very lumpy. It's either through negotiating a new contract or it's through the sale of a business. And many times it is a lifestyle business. They've been illiquid for multiple decades. They knew that this was coming, and that's why we need to begin the planning very early. And when we do, we have 6 CFPs on staff that work, and each of our clients works individually with not only a relationship manager, but also with a financial planner. And there's, as George was suggesting in the last panel, there's a roadmap, but then there's also a lot of detours because those variables are going to change. And this is a very good example of how the variables might change. To begin backwards with estate goals, legacy goals, philanthropic goals, cash flow goals that one needs in retirement, you need to guess what that bucket is going to look like to achieve all of those goals. And those are going to change over time, whether it's through higher valuations, lower valuations, decreased revenues, different capital structures on the purchase. Our financial plans have multiple buttons that we can choose, turn them on and off to decide, all right, how are we going to have this invested to get to this end goal? COVID is just another button that we can turn on and off, or the valuations that are offered right now is just another button that we can turn on and off of what this might look like in the end for our clients.
So I'm wondering, Charlie and George, in that regard, as you're going through the deal and you're working with the client, are you looking at their end goals and are your structures kind of changing because of COVID, because of their end goals in terms of what their financial needs might or might not be? Is that impacting it?
From our standpoint, the ideal situation for us is where a client comes to us, our prospective client comes to us enough in advance of the transaction that we can assess the business, get them to make the changes that are appropriate and necessary to enhance value and to make the transaction more efficient. Easy things, improve financial reporting, upgrade to an audit, upgrade to a quality accounting firm, things like that. There's some longer term issues like concentration in customers and things that might take more time, and we may not have time to do that. But one of the things that we try to encourage them to do, which we do not do, but we would refer, is to take a look at your personal situation. We can say, hey, look, we think this transaction is going to yield somewhere between $30 and $35 million for you. And your accountant can tell you what that means after tax, but your advisor needs to tell you what that means longer term, given your objectives. We like to be a part of that, listen, participant in that, so we can, while doing the deal, know when we're getting to a place where we may not be meeting that client's objectives and maybe suggest a pullback or a redirect.
So it becomes like a marker.
Correct.
So
correct.
It's a detour sign.
Yeah, a detour sign, yep.
Road sign to bring it back to the messaging. George, how about you?
I think what you're hearing also is a consistent theme of sooner rather than later. The best situation, which isn't what normally happens on some level, but the best situation would be able to, you'd have somebody from each representative here, investment banker, wealth management planner, lawyer, coming in sooner rather than later to assist with getting the groundwork laid out in order to be able to meet the goals and meet the expectations and work through it. It's not always that way, clearly. Usually a piece is missing. It's either Charlie or me, to be candid. I think it's true. I think it's, they're more apt to go to their accountant and their wealth advisor and somebody's been with them their whole life going through this stuff and helping them be prepared for the future, retirement, gifts. Charlie and I normally come after that discussion's had. And I can tell you, I know John's team will call me or call other lawyers to start beginning discussions around, hey, I want to give you a heads up. I want you to start thinking about this. And then they will reach out to Charlie. Or I've been in situations where I've been working with a client. I can see we need to put them together. I will tell them, let's get, an investment banker. Let's call Charlie. Who is your wealth planner? Oh, your Aunt Dolores. You've had, your money sitting in a muni fund, and you own a couple of shares of Apple. I think you need to talk to John. It's a rarity that you get the client that's taken everything already. So we as the advisors have to always be, ready and willing and on, not on guard, but be there to help. I mean, maybe it is on guard for them to get them the pieces they need to be successful. And it's important because if I don't know what John's talking about, or Charlie doesn't know what John's talking about, we come into a situation kind of blind, and Charlie's advice may be, X, Y, and Z, and you're not going to hit what you're told John you needed to. And if Charlie had been in the forefront with John and he knew that's what it was, there could have been discussion as to, hey, you got to be ready for it to be this and not this.
Sure.
And by the way, maybe you can get there, but call George because you've got to fix these 4 things.
So you have to have that team in place, right? So and so to back up a little bit from previous panels, I thought it'd be interesting to have some conversation around the real specific structures of transactions that happen. And obviously from my knowledge base, things like ESOPs or external sales, management sales, family succession, legacy planning. So can we drill into that a little bit and talk about your experiences around some of those structures and how they're being impacted?
I would say that if you think about the universe of possibilities for a business owner, they can do an internal sale, they can do a recapitalization with a private equity firm, which for our purposes assume that means they get 80% of their value and they roll over 20% of their value into the new company. They can sell to a strategic, usually where they get cash, maybe not all at closing. The identity of that company sort of generally goes away and they become a part of a bigger company. They can do an ESOP. They can go public. That doesn't happen in our world, but that's the universe. I think we all agree to that,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah. So we like to help clients think through all of those that are appropriate before making a decision. Okay, ESOPs get a lot of press, and they're very useful, but in our opinion, in limited circumstances.
Right.
I'll let these guys talk about what they are, but that's what we try to do is live in that universe of possibilities and try to get a company, the owners, to focus on the possibilities and how they each meet the objectives. And it usually is very clear which one or which 2 are the 2 they should pursue.
Well, has COVID been a neutral factor in those decisions, or is COVID playing a role in pushing you along that spectrum of?
It is playing a factor in the issue of particularly internal sales. Somebody has to be the bank. Commercial banks, by their own admission, are underwriting more conservatively. So, and they can only lend so much based on collateral and cash flow. So then the seller has to become a lender in a subordinated position. So we help them understand what that means, right? And in ESOP, we just have not seen very much ESOP activity this year. I can't explain why, but ESOP is a viable alternative for many companies. But again, I think some of the concern is that valuation may be down, and you're using a third-party independent valuation. It's not a negotiated number.
Right.
You have to go out and hire someone that's independent. They say, here's what the company is worth.
Go ahead, John. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to Charlie's point, I've not heard no requests for ESOPs or ESOP planning, not just in 2020, but in 2019 as well. And you're going to have as a seller, the lowest valuation with an ESOP. Now there's special situations, and if you've got the management team in place that you want to sell to, it's a great outcome, not just for you, but for your employees. But to Charlie's point, the valuations so far this year are down. You were already getting a discounted valuation with that exit method, so there's just been very little activity from our standpoint. I think the recaps are what we're seeing, and the strategic buys are what we're seeing more than anything else.
To kind of pile on the ESOP, yeah, they absolutely have their own realm of influence, and I think there are still many advisors pushing ESOPs. The only ESOP transaction I've had to do in the last 24 months is actually I'm buying a company out of an ESOP. The ESOP actually has constrained the company's ability to effectively pivot due to COVID. They don't have the cash, and they don't have the underlying baseline in order to be able to pivot to take advantage of some opportunities to replace some opportunities they lost. So if that transaction doesn't go forward because it's an ESOP, that company could actually fold because of the cap structure they're under. I think that Charlie hit it right on the point, with what the baseline, if you look at the realm of what your exit opportunities are, I think COVID has absolutely affected each one of those opportunities. And you go back to John's world and you have to figure out, okay, what's the seller's real objective here? What is there? Are they looking to sell to management? Are they willing to be the bank a little bit? Are they willing to effectively lease out their company to the current management team in return for hopefully a return and a payment in the future? I think, again, it's looking at what the end goal is, what's going on in the marketplace and their business that's happening, whether or not, again, as we talked in one of our previous panels about strength in numbers, economic herd immunity. Do you go off and do a strategic deal because, you're kind of on the cusp of saying, I'm done, but COVID hits and you don't want to do it anymore, but you don't really want to give up, leave, or maybe you do, but you've got people you care about. The strategic could be a good play. A financial buyer, a private equity-backed buyer, Charlie's hit it on the head. There's normally a rollover, 80-20. 80% of your cash, maybe some of it's in a seller note, maybe some of it's an earn-out, depending upon the economics.
So are sellers having to assume more risk in these transactions?
I will tell you, in the past 3 transactions we've been in the middle of, I think sellers are having to take on more of the allocation of risk underlying the deal. The reps and warranties associated with business are getting tougher right now. Indemnification is getting more concrete. There's a desire to know that we're buying this company and we know what we're buying. And in return for that, I think the purchase price, the manner in which the purchase price is calculated and the manner in which it's paid, I think it's fluctuating a lot. And it really does depend upon industry and the effect that COVID's had on it. So I would say that sellers are being asked to step up a little bit stronger on their reps and warranties and backing up their company. And I think there's more flexibility that would probably not be there on the payment of the purchase price today.
Well, on the flip side, then, are the buyers being more demanding? Are they dictating terms more? Are they in the driver's seat, so to speak?
If you want the same multiple that you were getting a year ago, I think that they exist, but the buyers are more demanding. In strategic cases, as an example, I haven't seen one without an earn-out attached to it. And in the private equity cases, I think there's a lot of minority recaps rather than majority recaps. Taking it for a test drive. Let's see what happens over the next couple of years before we decide if we want a second bite of the apple.
I would say I agree with that. The key for us in what we do is to try to have multiple buyers at the table for a long time.
Right.
And
Balance
it changes
out
the leverage a little bit. That's not always possible. Right. It's just the reality.
Sure.
But if we can keep 1 or 2 or 2 or 3 at the table And everyone knows we're negotiating LOIs, and we're trying to get some of these things in the LOI, because if we get in the LOI, it makes George's job a little bit easier. Not easy to get it into the transaction documents. That's what we're trying to do. Now, that's an imperfect science, so we are not always able to do that.
Well, you neutralize that feeling like I got control over the situation. I'm the only guy in the game or person in the game. And all of a sudden they realize there's other players around. Changes the dynamic.
And the other thing we try to do is to, in an LOI, try to be creative about exclusivity, that the buyer has exclusive time to deal with this company. And if we can have outs and make it a shorter duration while they're spending all this money, the leverage can also change there, that we can have, a little bit more say about some of these things.
But are those principles pretty standard in general, or do you think those principles are coming into play now because of COVID? Because
I think they're pretty standard. I think they're pretty standard, yeah.
If we can divert to succession planning and the family legacy business for a couple different reasons. One, my own background, but our two speakers today were Anna Gavin and Caroline Kirshnick, both who are family succession businesses, third generation. Any special thoughts about that? Have you been involved in any succession planning? Has COVID impacted that in any way, shape, or form in any particular way?
From my standpoint, it's interesting. We've been in some family succession planning, not so much for a sale, but maybe for getting it to the next generation, and then maybe a minority recap to get mom, dad, brother, sister, whomever, a little cash and give it on to the next generation who's been in the business. We've actually seen it, I would say in a couple of instances, stall. Business, feels the effect of COVID. Next generation's been there all along, but there's more of a feeling of family. This is a familial issue, so let's get all hands on deck. So we've seen some of the planning, the actual implementation, maybe I should say, of the planning stall a little bit. We've seen some of the planning, conceptually stall, like, yeah, we agree, this is what we want to do. We need to get through this, and then we want to implement it, and then we want to go hire Charlie and find a way to, get a partner in for our son, our daughter, our nephew, our niece, whomever is running the business. So that way the family owners can get cashed out to some degree. The next generation comes in, but has somebody there that can back them. We're seeing the planning occur, but it's fourth gear, second gear, and in some cases it's, can you go park the car?
It's interesting what we have been seeing, and this preceded COVID, is the conversation is the owners come to us and say, our children do not want to be in the business.
Yeah.
They're at Harvard, they're majoring in technology or want to go to medical school or want to be a bioengineer, and they have no interest in our business. So what do we do? So we're seeing more of that than, hey, how can you help us get this business to the next generation? We see that, and it's plenty there, but there's clearly an emerging trend of people, of families that are faced with the decision that their children do not want to take over the.
In this current generation, more than you saw it in previous generations?
I actually had a client say the worst thing that ever happened to me in this world was medical school. I mean, and he said, no, my daughter's in medical school. She worked for me all throughout high school, and he's got a nice business, $20-30 million business, and it's a traditional business, doing great. Even during COVID, was doing solid. He's like, I thought she majored in business and minored in something else, and suddenly she took the MCATs and she's off to medical school, and and you can see it. And as he's telling me, the facial expression is getting more and more sour. So I think you have COVID, as Charlie said, then you have this whole group of individuals and families who thought they were going to have the next generation. They're gone. So they're going through COVID. They don't have anybody to send it off to. And now they're in a position where they're having, as Charlie would say, is, what are we doing?
And they're moving to those other structures.
So then we go full circle. Internal sales or transition families out. Is there a management team can buy it? Do you consider a recap with private equity? Do you consider an ESOP? Do you consider a sale to a industry player? What are your choices?
It's just amazing. And John, I'm sure you're dealing with some of the legacy money, right? So Now it's not a question of how we pass the business on. Now that I got my $30 million, $50 million check, do I send that down to my kids at all?
That may be part of the motivation. I mean, they can either pass on a business at a much lower multiple, but access to private equity partners right now, there's just so much capital, ready capital out there looking for a rate of return. If you have that family conversation and the kids know this is the multiple that I'm being offered for the business, sometimes that makes a decision very easy. I'll go to med school. Go ahead and sell the business.
And go live on a beach somewhere, I guess.
I was going to say, go become an underwater basket weaver.
That's right. So let's talk a little bit more about risk allocation too, because I know we've mentioned that quite a bit. Somebody's got to assume more risk than others. Either it's the buyer or the seller. So can we talk a little bit, and George, you mentioned that even before, and I made a special note of it. Valuation aside, everything else aside, COVID's been an accelerant. It's accelerated something. It's lit the fire.
If I know it's not a risk, I'll take it. No, risk allocation is a tenet of all M&A investment deals. Period. End of story. And it's been since the beginning of time. You hear people say, buy as is, buy as is. Well, that's the ultimate risk allocation. It's like, give me the money, I'm out. I mean, that's just not the way it works. So every step of the transaction is about risk allocation. Once you've established purchase price valuation, it really is about risk allocation, because as a lawyer, I can't help the client get to the valuation that Charlie would say this company's worth, or John would say this is what you need to go off into the sunset, if I'm not able to properly assist, guide, and clean up the risk allocation situation. And that's the whole concept behind a deal: due diligence, negotiating documents. A great big dance begins to play out the minute the LOI is signed. It's a dance up until then, but then another dance starts, and it's normally with me, and that's why everybody at the end of the day hates lawyers. But we're there, the old adage is, I hate lawyers, but I love mine. The job is, during that time period, is to identify, mitigate, or bury. And you need it, and it's a dance with the client, it's a dance with the buyer, but or it's a dance with the seller if I'm representing the buyer, but also it's a dance with the other advisors, because John may know something I don't know. The CEO owner actually had to pay for his son's rehab 4 years ago, and his son's now, out on the job moving, equipment. I need to know that. Charlie may know there's 3 other deals that went down. Here's what their process was. This is the risk where they had some of the same customers here, which is why we already did this with the valuation. I need to know that, because when we get into the customer contract discussion and they say, well, this customer's done this and this, it's already the value. Nice try. Risk allocation is also about dealing with phantoms. What's real, what's not. A buyer will always escalate the look, feel, taste, smell of a risk, because it's normally a pressure point on the multiple, on the cash, on some aspect of the deal that they want to try to get their hands around. Risk allocation takes many forms and documents. It's the reps, the warranties, it's what you disclose, but then it's also me sitting down with Charlie, John. We've kicked around this concept of an earnout. I will pay you X if the company does Y after it's sold, or I've made my investment. Well, that's risk allocation. That's tying money to whether or not you believe the company can do something. I'm not going to take the risk of paying you that much more unless I know this is going to happen. And that's really where Charlie, dives deep into, what's the models, what's the forecast, what's really going on here. That's where John's sitting there trying to explain to his client, yeah, you want $50 million so you can go off into the sunset. You can get to 40, and there's a 10 that you're just going to have to, stick around and help make happen.
John, how do those conversations sound to you? What do they sound? So if I say to you, yeah, but I want really conservative stuff when I get out of here, John, what does that mean I have to earn now? Because I'm not taking any risk. I just want to put cash in the bank and sit on it.
Our CEO just is a great storyteller, and all of our business owners, it starts with bucketing your assets at the point of transition. And you have your bucket, to George's point, maybe it's 40 million, maybe it's 20 million, maybe it's 15 million, but these are my safe assets. When I die, whether it's 92, 94, 96, I want this bucket to be 0. This bucket is going to be my growth assets, my stocks, my bonds, my municipals. I want to grow this at 7, 8% a year, whatever that number might be. And if it grows more rapidly than that, you can spend some of that growth bucket off into the living assets. And then the aspirational bucket, and whether that's legacy, philanthropy, another acquisition, because let's face it, a lot of business owners are serial acquirers. They want to have money on the side for the next one, right? I mean, you guys see that all the time, I'm sure. So we want to start the plan 3 to 5 years prior to exit. It doesn't always come together that way, but ideally, if we can begin the planning that early, we can have those buckets set, know what it's going to look like, and again, and have those variables ready to switch on and off if we can't achieve that by the time they're ready to go.
And Charlie, you're kind of the dance instructor, right? Everybody comes in trying to figure out how to make this dance work, and you sit there and you map out the steps. How's that for an analogy?
Use dance and my name in the same sentence.
Well, you can feel free to use that from now on.
Right. We ask clients to think about a transaction in 3 equal size boxes. And if you have a whiteboard, you can draw it, it helps. But the first box is valuation, equal size to currency, equal size to post-closing risk. So as we work with George and the client to get to an LOI, the valuation can be great, but the currency is not, or the post-closing risk is not fair. That's not a good transaction.
Sure.
So we have to go, okay, we have a good valuation. Let's get fair currency, cash, stock, earn out, sell or note, make sure it's fair. And then let's go to the post-closing risk. What is fair? Let's make sure it's a fair allocation of that. If we get good grades in all 3 boxes, we have a really good transaction. And as a seller, you need to get that at least outlined in the LOI, or you're at a disadvantage from that point forward. So it's really an important concept. But so many people just focus on valuation and they stop thinking. And that's a very dangerous way to approach a transaction.
Well, that's a good way to wrap this up. I mean, I think that kind of puts it in a little package. Any other things that you guys think we left out that you want to finish with? Or we can all ride off into the sunset?
I've learned a lot today. These two.
Yeah, well, I gotta, thank these guys. They're the smart ones on this panel. So we have Charlie Maskell, Chesapeake Corporate Advisors, John Morgan, Verdence Capital, and George Nemphos, Nemphos Braue. Thanks for being up here and sharing your knowledge and your information. And thank you all for attending. And hope you all got a lot out of it. We'll be talking again soon.